Hi guys, this is Reddy. In this session, I am going to explain Springboot interview question and answers. Let's go ahead and start. The first question is, what is Springboot and features of the Springboot? The features of the Springboot are auto configuration. By using the auto configuration, the Springboot scans for the class path and what are the libraries it is available, and based on the jars whatever it is available, it automatically do the configuration. For example, if you want to connect it to the JDBC or JDBC template or the data source, what you just need to do is you need to basically add the specific jar. For example, if you want to connect to the H2 database, then if your jar is available related to the H2 in the class path, then automatically prepares the data source connections. So those are the, if you want to work with the security, then you just need to add the jars related to the security, then automatically security related configuration will be taken care by the Springboot. So it basically eliminates the lot of boilerplate code which basically you generally write for the configurations. And the second important feature is the starters in the build tools. Now, for example, if you want to start an application from the scratch, then you have to take care of a lot of dependencies which are required for your project. Instead of that, Springboot is basically comes up with the starters where you just need to add the what exactly the starter for your application, then underlining dependencies automatically taken care by the Springboot. And then Springboot CLI, so command line interface. By using the Springboot command line interface, you can quickly start the Springboot application based on your spec, and also it will allow you to basically work with the scripting tools like scripting languages like a Groovy. And if you know these languages, then you can easily focus on what the development part, and you can easily build the application. And next one is the Spring Initializer. So this is the one of the important tool which basically available online by the Springboot framework. So if you want to start your application from the scratch, so you have to consider all the dependencies manually, download all the dependency jars, and then you have to start your project. Instead of that, Spring Initializer is a website where you can go and basically basically create your application by specifying what are the required modules are required for your particular project. Then automatically Spring Initializer is going to provide you the user interface where you just select the components, and it automatically download the skeleton for your project. Then you can start actual development. Then Actuators is basically provides you the provide you a mechanism where you can monitor the health for your application, like how many sessions, how many connections, how many data resources, and you if you want to analyze the logs. So those type of interfaces is provided with the Actuators. So these are the important features of the Spring Boot. Now the next question is, what is the difference between the Spring and the Spring versus Spring Boot frameworks? If you see the Spring, you have to do the lot of boilerplate code in order to implement the JDBC or JPA or Hypernet or the MVC, anything. But in the case of Spring Boot application, it basically minimizes the number of the lines what you are basically writing by eliminating the boilerplate code and also XML configuration, and it will provide you the annotations, and ultimately which is going to enhance your productivity of your development of your application. Then XML configurations are required in the case of Spring, but in the case of Spring Boot, mostly you can eliminate the XML configurations by replacing them with either the annotations or the Java beans. And additional configurations are required in order to integrate with the AOP or the batch or security. In the case of Spring Boot, it is like it is opinionated and follows the convention over the configuration software design paradigm. That means you just need to focus on what are the things you required with the minimal configuration or the minimal information. If you put, then you can actually start your application. And also by using the Spring Boot, it can easily integrate with these applications like ORM, Spring JDBC, Spring Security, and Spring Data. And another important difference is the dependencies. So in the case of Spring application, you have to manually define your dependencies for your project in the pom.xml file, which is tedious tedious job, because if you want to upgrade to the newer version of the any Spring job, then underlining transitive dependencies, you have to taken care of it. But in the case of Spring Boot, which basically allows you to rapidly build and create a Spring application utilizing the Spring framework, and Spring comes with the concept of the starter, where you just need to define the what is the starter for your application, then underlying dependencies will be taken care by the Spring Boot application. And the next important difference is about the testing. In order to test the Spring Boot Spring project, you have to set up the environment explicitly to test your Spring project. But in the case of Spring Boot, it offers like a inbuilt Jetty or the HTTP servers such as Jetty or the Tomcat, and where you can directly write your code and directly test at the runtime instead of actually again creating a separate environment for the testing. And also it offers command line interface tools for developing in a Groovy to eliminate the boilerplate of code. And Spring does not support in-memory databases. If you want to test some POC, if you want to do, then again you have to manually download the another database or like a MySQL, the Derby database. You have to set up the database explicitly and you have to do the POC. But in the case of Spring Boot, it comes with the in-memory database plugins like a H2 database or the Derby. Then once you add the specific jars in the class path, then remaining things automatically taken care by the Spring Boot itself. And the Spring Boot provides the actuators to monitor and manage your application health. And also Spring Boot framework used to develop the microservices, because Spring Boot framework is basically suitable for the production. You can easily develop with the production ready applications with minimum effort. That is the reason these are suitable for the microservices oriented architecture related application. And the next third important question is, what are the frequent annotations used in this Spring Boot? So as you know, if you are working with the Spring Boot, the one important annotation you need to remember is @ Spring Boot application. So this annotation is basically used to auto configure and component scan and able to define the extra configurations on their application class. That means once we knew any class, if you are annotating @ Spring Boot application, then it automatically identifies what are the packages it has to scan, and also what are the components basically in that scan packages are available, and it is going to create a beans for it. And also it will automatically enable auto configuration. So these are the three basically. If I'm talking about, if you don't put the @ Spring application, then below 3 annotation you have to specify at the class level. So instead of these 3 annotations, you can directly annotate with the @ Spring Boot application. Then the next annotation is @ enable auto configuration. So which is basically enable the Spring Boot auto configuration mechanism. And once you add this annotation for the at the application level, then automatically it will scan your class path, and based on this class path jars, it automatically do the auto configuration related to your, either it might be a JDBC or it might be a security or it might be a JDBC templates. It automatically create those objects. And @ component scan is basically useful, because currently what happens is, whenever you use any class with this @ Spring Boot application, then Spring Boot automatically scans all the sub packages under the class where you define here. For example, if you want to scan outside of any of these packages, then you have to specify @ component scan. And @ configuration is basically allow you to register the extra beans in the context, or import additional configuration classes which are required for your application. Then you are going to use the @ configuration. Then @ REST controller is basically used whenever you are implementing the RESTful web services using the Spring Boot. Then REST controller is the important annotation, which is basically @ control plus @ response body. So which basically tells like you are implementing the RESTful web services using the Spring Boot, so that it will take the controller, and also every part of every request is basically it has to send the response. That is what it means. And then at the rate of request mapping is basically to map your URL to the particular REST endpoint. We basically use the at the rate of request mapping. And then enable auto configuration, we already seen this one, which basically automatically load the configuration based on the class path and prepare the objects or the data sources accordingly. And then we have the another annotations like a at the rate of configuration, and which is followed by the, at the conditional on class. Similarly, at the rate of configuration and conditional on missing classes. So these annotations basically lets you load the classes based on the certain conditions, and also if it is not available, then what are the classes it has to load, you can do it. And if you see the another annotation is the at the rate of conditional on property, and it is also having a two properties, having value and match if missing. So this is going to lets you configuration be included based on the Spring environment property. For example, if you want to say there is a one value equal, then you can do some operation. If it is not available, then you can do some other initialization, or the conditionally you can set the values. And the next one is conditional on resource, which is basically allow you to include the resources or the configuration when a specific resource is present. So based on the condition, if you want to include some resource, you can do using this annotation. And then at the rate of conditional on web application, and the if you want to include or the this is going to allow you to configure certain classes based on the web application. And if it is not, then you can say another annotation saying like at the rate of conditional on not web application. So if you want to add some configurations exclusively for the web application, then you can use this conditional on web application. If you want to include some configurations with for the non web application, they can use this annotation. And if you want to enable for your application for the JMS, then enable JMS is going to be used. And if you want to enable for caching your application, then you have to use at the rate of enable caching, which basically tells like a Spring Boot you are going to use the caching for your application. And if you want to test your Spring Boot application, then at the rate of test you are going to provide at the class level and the method level. And then at the rate of enable rabbit, if you want to use RabbitMQ for your application, this is the at the rate of enable rabbit. And if you want to use the batch processing for your Spring Boot application, then at the rate of enable batch processing. And at the rate of messaging endpoint and enable integration is for the Spring integration. And if you want to use the Tomcat with the Spring MVC, then at the rate of controller, at the rate of REST controller, at the rate of enable web MVC. So this configuration, these annotations is basically help you to work with the Spring MVC framework in the Spring Boot. And then if you want to enable the security for your application, then you can enable using the at the rate of enable web security. And if you want to use the transaction management for your Spring Boot application, then you can use the annotation at the rate of enable transaction management at the repository class level or the service class level, wherever you want to implement this transaction management. The next important question is, how do you change the Tomcat default port number in the Spring Boot? So in order to change the Tomcat default port number, you basically have to use the you have to change them in the application.properties file. So Spring support various type of the formats for the application properties. One is the application.properties where the key value pair will be there. Another one is the YAML file. Now for example, if you are using the application.properties, then you just need to say like a server.port, and you can you can give the whatever the port number you want to use. But by default, Tomcat is basically pointing to the 8080 is the default port number. Now, where do you configure the application related properties? So application related properties basically in the Spring Boot we are going to configure in the application.properties file. Now if you have the like a profiles, then one property file for the dev, one property file for the staging, one property file for the QA, and one property file for the production. So once you are defining these properties file, you can have the key value pairs for your application, like a server related, port related information, and also Spring related, data source related properties you can define. Similarly, security related thing you can define, and Hikari related properties, and log level logging related properties. So whatever the configuration properties you require for your application, basically you can define them in the application.properties file. And it is good to practice, or you can good to create properties file for each environment one, and at the runtime you can decide which property file it has to pick. So that is what generally we used to do. Like this, if you are using the YAML file, then the format will be in the some different format, but you can define Spring Boot application.properties in the form of YAML file as well. And the next important question is, how do you provide the context path for your application? Now you know context path for your application is basically provided in the application.properties file, where basically you have to say servlet.context path, and here you can provide the whatever the custom path for your application you want it, you can provide it. So based on this context path, basically when you launch your application, by default it will open the your application will be opened using this context path. The next important question is, how do you define profiles in the Spring Boot? So profiles are the basically the by using the profiles you can basically configure, or you can configure your application property related. For certain environment it should be available, and certain environment it should not available. Then you have to go with the concept of the profiles. Okay, so in the Spring provides a way to segregate parts of your application configuration and make it available only in the certain environments. Now here, in order to do that, basically at the rate of component or configuration we have to use it, and then you can specify which profile is basically used for that particular class or the bean. Now if you see here example, this is the product configuration. We are annotating this class with the at the rate of configuration, and we are saying that at the rate of profile and say production. So that means this class, whatever the configuration you are going to do for this particular class, it is only applicable for the production environment. If you are not using for this one, for example, you have the multiple environments like a dev, QA and staging, then those environment, this class is not applicable. So in order to specify this specific profile for your Spring Boot application, you have to specify this one. So spring.profiles.active, and you can specify what is the profile you have to consider for this environment. Now in this case we are giving the production. So whenever you mark this profile as a production, then only this class is going to be, that means this profile will be considered and this class has a life for it. Otherwise it does not have any life. Now for example, if you are using any type of like a command line tools like a Gradle or the Maven, then in order to specify which profile it has to consider, you can pass the additional property in the command line saying -d spring.profiles.active, and you can specify the profile name here. Either it might be a dev, staging or the production. Okay, so this is how basically you are defining the profiles in the Spring Boot, and it is important because based on the profiles, certain configurations are available for the certain environments. Okay, so this is how you basically define the profiles. And another important one is the Spring Initializer. So one of the key feature of the Spring Boot application is the Spring Initializer, where you basically create skeleton of your project by using this particular Spring Initializer. You go to your website, you can see, you can choose which type of project, either it is a Maven or the Gradle, and language either Java, Kotlin or the Groovy, and which version of the Spring Boot you want to use it, and what is the group ID, artifact ID, and then dependencies you just need to type here. Then once whatever the required modules for your application, if you just add through this UI, then Spring Initializer is going to create a skeleton for this project, so that you no need to think much about the underlying dependencies, what are the jars I have to place to start this project. So those things will be taken care by this Spring Initializer you can say the application. So it is very easy, user friendly, and you can directly jump onto actually development phase of your project instead of actually spending more time on how to set up the environment for your application. And the final one is, what are the Spring Boot starters and why we need it. So starters contain a lot of dependencies that needs to get a project up and running quickly and without a consistent supported set of managed transitive dependencies. Now let us consider, in order to start your project, any project if you want to start, the most of the time the developers are going to set is the spending much time on how to set up the environment and how to create a base for your project. Now by using these Spring Boot starters, the minimum things you just need to add it in the pom.xml or the build.gradle file. Then automatically underlining things will be taken care by the these starters will basically identifies the what are the transitive dependencies related jars, and it automatically downloaded and it will provide you the environment. You can quickly start the development. That is the important concept of the Spring Boot. Now for each and every type of application, Spring Boot provides a certain starters. Now if you see Spring Boot starter, which basically provide the core features like a auto configuration and the logging and YAML file, it will automatically provide. If you want to work on the ActiveMQ, just add the starter spring-boot-starter-ActiveMQ. Then underlining dependencies which are required for the ActiveMQ will be taken care by the Spring Boot starter for this. Similarly, if you want to work with for example, if you want to work with the Spring JDBC, then just add this dependency spring-boot-starter-data-JDBC. Then it is used to basically, it will prepare the environment to work with the Spring JDBC. Similarly, for the if you want to work with the JPA, this is the starter. You basically add it in your pom.xml or the build.gradle file. So like this, for each and every type of feature, or you can consider like a type of the feature you want to implement, the Spring Boot basically provides you the starter. Once you add that starter, you are done with your work, and the remaining things, the underlying dependencies will be taken care by the Spring Boot. And also tomorrow, if you are upgrading to the newer version of the Spring Boot application, then underlining dependencies automatically taken care by the Spring Boot. You no need to worry much about the what are the transitive dependencies are valid or correct or incorrect. You can ignore those type of underlying complications are taken care by the Spring Boot framework itself using these starters. Now there are many starters are available. You just have to go through it, and then you just need to add the proper starter based on your functionality. It might be sometimes it may require like you have to add more than one starter based on your need, but basically by using the starter, which basically removes the underlying complexity of managing the transitive dependencies if you put manually. So those things will be taken care by the Spring Boot framework itself, and it will expose them with the starters where you can quickly start your application by putting the starters, and you can start developing on it. So these are the important questions which frequently asked during the interviews. If you have any questions, please comment on my YouTube video. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day and all the best for your interviews.